We have a very special guest today as our main speaker, and I got a chance to talk to her just a little bit, but in reading her bio, I think you're going to all be pretty excited about listening to her speak. Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia is with us today. She's a physician, a scholar, an educator, and a speaker. She has newly been appointed Chief Medical Director for Volunteers of America, Oregon, the state's branch of a national organization that provides social services to the most vulnerable segments of America's population. She continues her tenure at Oregon Health and Science University as Director of the Abel Gordley Center for Healing and as Assistant Professor of Psychiatry. And she's here today to talk to us about her program, Healing Hurt, and other things. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Moreland-Capuia. Dr. Capuia, you have to stand in the light, or Torin will.
We'll stay in the light. Well, thank you all for having me today. I'm really thrilled to be here. And actually, before I start, can you stand? So you guys will never guess who Kate is and has been to me. So I grew up here in Portland, Oregon, King School, librarian, fifth grade. Taught me how to read, how to write, always sort of fostered our interest in books and learning, and now look where I am, Kate. Not too bad. Awesome. Well, again, thank you to Corinne, thank you to all of you for having me here today. Thank you for the wonderful presentation on supernovas, right? And it's actually interesting because as you talk about this process of violence and how actually something so beautiful can come out of something so hard and horrible, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So you didn't know that you were actually giving me a nice introduction to the talk, the things I'm going to talk about today. So I am, as is said, from Portland, Oregon, a professor. I'm okay in the light?
Yeah.
I'm okay. You direct me.
Point at me whenever you want to go that.
You just want me to give you a point? Okay, great. So just by way of a little bit of introduction, I am from Portland, Oregon, born and raised here. Went to a product of Portland Public Schools, went to Sacagawea Head Start, King Elementary, Tubman Middle School, Jefferson High School, then went on to Stanford University, from Stanford to George Washington University School of Medicine in DC, back here to Oregon at Oregon Health and Science University for a 4-year residency, and then did an additional year of training and fellowship for addictions. So I'm a board certified psychiatrist that also specializes in addictions, and I'll actually be double board certified after 2016, because that's the next time they offer board. So that is sort of just a little bit about who I am. In addition, I'm married to a wonderful man, Daniel, who's here. Daniel, can you? Oh, well, he's recording. The guy in the beautiful bow tie back there. And we share 3 children together, who are also in a mixture of public and private schools. So that's just a little bit. So today I wanted to talk to you about a program. Corinne went to the OPB website and heard about our program, Healing Hurt People Portland. And when she went to the website, she was inspired enough to email me and say, can you please consider coming to chat with the group Sunday Assembly about the work that you're doing. So that's what I'm going to do today. I have about 17 slides, and I hope to be able to engage you all in conversation a little bit. So this is just really just a beginning slide. Let me give you a little bit of backstory. So I want you to imagine a 10-year-old boy of color in Milwaukee who enters the Milwaukee Emergency Department, Children's Emergency Department, being severely beat up. He goes there, he's seen, he's patched up, he's allowed to leave. 3 years later, this same boy comes back to the Milwaukee Emergency Room Department, and this time he's been stabbed multiple times. Again, he's patched up, he's released, and he goes on with his life. Literally 3 years later, so again, follow me. First entry was at 10, second was at 13. Then he returns again 3 years later at 16. And this time It was in a body bag. He had been shot and killed. So the question becomes this, and it does get better from here, but I want to set the tone, right? So what did not happen in those interactions over the 6-year span that this young man showed up to the emergency department in Milwaukee? Physicians did a fabulous job of patching him up, suturing him, taking care of the physical wounds. But what had not really been impacted or changed or even addressed were the psychological wounds. So there's a process of violence. So very great job of saying, we're gonna fix you up, get you out, but we really didn't address the disease of violence. That this young man had come beat up and there was no intervention there to say, maybe we should step in and try to do something different. And maybe, perhaps, just maybe, had there been a program at the time like Healing Hurt People, and we'll talk a little bit more what that is, he would not have ended up in a body bag, because that's, I say, potential lost. The future president, the future doctor, the future lawyer who could be making a positive contribution to the community, he's gone, right? Great job of addressing the physical wounds, but not the psychological wounds. So that's the first point. And this story is a true story and is what inspired the development of Healing Hurt People like programs. So if we can move to the next slide. There's a book and 2 physicians, a book called Wrong Time, Wrong Place. Dr. John Rich, who is an internal medicine physician back at Drexel in Philadelphia, and Dr. Ted Corbett, who is an emergency room physician back at Drexel and also an NPH. They wrote the book, co-authored it, Wrong Place, Wrong Time. And this is what he said, one quote. He says, sadly, in many ways, violence has come to define the urban neighborhoods of our country. African American communities especially have been tagged with the label of dangerous, largely because of the young men who have become symbols of violence and crime. Can we head to the next slide? So I wanted to give a little bit of context. Let's talk a little bit first before we get into the heart of the program, the cost of violence. So according to the CDC, there's many CDCs, we're talking here about the Centers for Disease Control, 2.2 million medically treated injuries due to interpersonal violence annually cost $37 billion. $33 billion of that is lost productivity, and $4 billion is in medical treatment. Just to give you some context, let's think about that. Folks between the ages of 15 to 44 represent 44% of our population. Now that's a large contingent, but they account for 75% of the injuries and over 80% of the cost due to interpersonal violence. The average cost of homicide is about $1.3 million in lost productivity and over $4,000 in medical costs. Further to that point, the average cost per case for a non-fatal assault resulting in hospitalization is about $57,000 in lost productivity and over $24,000 in medical costs. And I'm not reducing people to numbers, because that's not what the goal of this is. It's just to give you some context as to the larger societal impact of violence and why it's important for us sort of to intervene and to find some creative ways to do that. The Department of Community Justice here, we're going to bring it home to Multnomah County. Juvenile Services Branch estimate that it costs approximately $350 a day for high-risk offenders to be in prison. However, if we treat them in the community, which there are, not to shamelessly plug Volunteers of America, but we do have a community-based community monitoring program that treats this very population, it costs $50 per day to do that, and we're able to get more positive outcomes and to reduce recidivism. So they're not going back into the prison system, we're helping get them jobs and helping them get back into education so that they are contributing in ways that we know they have the ability to do. So that's one end, the cost. Let's talk a little bit about what trauma is and how it's defined. So, many of you, it sounds like many of you are scientists. How many of you are scientists or think you are? Or want to be? Well, that's great. So we're among friends. And that's why I said I didn't expect to hear about physics today, but I tend to sort of geek off on those things too. I'm sort of undercover. I don't really tell people those things. But I'm not ashamed of it though. So if we think about the brain and how it sort of developed, when we were all born, we have, the survival, what's called the survival or the lower brain, the survival center of our brains is developed at birth. And this survival center basically regulates our what's called autonomic functions. It helps us to breathe, to digest, it regulates our heart rate, sleep, hunger, sort of those instinctual behaviors. It's sort of what we would call the early brain, right? The early, sort of less complicated brain. You know, back in the early days when we were hunters and gatherers, you know, you really needed to, if you're running from a lion, are you really concerned about pooping or peeing at that time? Probably not as much, right? But your heart is picked up, your breathing is probably picked up, and really the goal is about survival. So that's really what we call the survival center, the lower brain. Then we have the emotional brain, which is where sort of the amygdala lies, and that really is the emotional center of our brain. And that develops around ages 0 to 4. And that is where we process memory, emotions, responses to stress, nurturing, caring, separation anxiety, fear, rage, social bonding, and hormonal control. Then we get to the higher brain, which is sort of the cerebral cortex. And that's where we're capable of higher thinking. This is also when most people would argue in emerging adulthood, it's the part of the brain that is not fully developed in adolescence, which is probably why they should not drink or use marijuana, because you're damaging the ability to sort. And not that I'm making any political statement on that, just saying from a biologic, sort of physiologic standpoint, it's not fully developed, and so judgment tends to be off, right? And we don't want to do anything to further deviate judgment from where it should be. So, but approximately ages 5 to 6, 11 to 12, it continues throughout the 20s, and for men throughout the 40s. It's just kidding. I know, I'm just kidding. But it's the area where we handle logic, empathy, compassion, creativity, self-regulation, self-awareness, sequencing, planning, problem solving, and attention. So it's an important area. I want to take you back to the survival center of the brain. And I said, when is that developed? The survival center of the brain? Scientist? At birth. Right. So here's where trauma happens. We know about the fight, or freeze response, right? That is a very normal response to fear. When things come our way, if a bear is running at me, I can either do one of 3 things. I can either fight it, which would not be that smart. I can either flee, which probably also wouldn't be that smart, or I can freeze, which might be a more reasonable. These are all, and these responses are all natural physiological responses, but what happens, you might ask, if I am always in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze? Could you imagine? I just want you to think about it. I'm giving you context because I'm going to move quickly through the other slides. If I'm in a constant state of responding to fear, or even perceiving things that come at me as fearful situations, and that's how I operate, really, if I stay at that level, and I'm always in my survival part of the brain, then that's really trauma. And what that says is that we all really are apt or prone. We sit sort of on that on a cliff, sort of on a traumatic cliff, and any push can really take you over, right? But that's trauma, and trauma comes in many forms. So I talk about running from a bear, but what if I was an African-American male, and just by being African-American, I've got a target on my back. I get a little nervous because the police is behind me, and even though I didn't do anything wrong, I'm feeling kind of stressed about it. What if I'm sort of, I've got tattoos everywhere, and I've got earrings, people make assumptions, and I'm downtown, I'm a young person, and this has happened, and I get stopped by somebody, and I'm harassed because of the way I look, or because of how people perceive me. Trauma happens in many ways, and then there's childhood trauma, there's all forms of trauma. But if I live in that state, it can be a problem, right? So here's another way to sort of think about that. What Vander Kolk said in 1989 is that traumatization occurs when both our internal and external resources are insufficient or inadequate to cope with the external threat. So it's just too big, and we can't conquer it, so we're traumatized. So I want you to understand this in the context of the prior slide, because I'm going to talk about what it means to be trauma informed. Being trauma informed, in essence, is understanding this very key concept, but also understanding a very oversimplified version. I didn't know who the audience was going to be today, so I didn't go through all of the specific areas of the brain. If you're interested, that would be another talk I'd be happy to do with you. But essentially, bear in mind, we've got a place for emotional processing, a place for more higher level executive functioning, and then we've just got a straight survival part of our brain. You know, basically the brain stem, the midbrain, and the cerebral cortex, if we were to sort of break it down, okay? So, next slide. So that sort of leads me to healing her people and what it is. Okay, bear in mind I've talked about the cost of what violence does, you know, how it impacts us, and then I've talked a little bit about the physiology, if you will, of trauma and what that could look like. So Healing Hurt People, Portland, is in essence a hospital-based violence intervention program. It's community focused. This is a national model that we brought here about 2 years ago, and I should say that the manager of Healing Hurt People, Cheryl Johnson, is here. If you want to wave, master's level teacher back there. So it's a national model. There are 22 other programs like it across the country. Philadelphia, Baltimore, 3 in Chicago, there are 4 in Oakland. We are the first in the Pacific Northwest. So it's a national model. We didn't just sort of drag it out of anywhere. It's data driven. We were looking at sort of high impact groups. We serve young males of color between the ages of 10 to 25 who've suffered a penetrating trauma. And again, if you've been stabbed, shot, or brutally assaulted, you fall in that category. It's hospital-based, community-focused, and we talk about that because some people say, if you're familiar with healthcare transformation, that hospital-based piece people probably struggle with. Well, if they're in the hospital, that costs a lot of money. Yes, that's true. What we're talking about is intervening at a specific area for the point of prevention. And so it's about what we do once we get them in the hospital. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and keeping them out of the hospital so we save money over time. And it's trauma-informed. And what trauma-informed means is that now that I've been traumatized, and it's sort of like the midbrain unwoven, right? It's hijacked. I'm on high alert. And so we have one of two responses, right? Is that either I can do something, I can become a positive trigger or a negative trigger. So I can do things that either pull people closer to their trauma or do things that pull them further away from it. So being trauma-informed really, in essence, changes the way we interact with people, and it's a healthy understanding of how trauma happens, but it also effectively changes the questions we ask. So I don't look at Cassie and say, Cassie, what's wrong with you? Mm-hmm. That's not a very trauma-informed question, is it? No. Right? But instead I look at Cassie and I say, Cassie, what happened to you? Do you see how that effectively changes the way that I'm engaging with Cassie? I'm making no assumptions. The only assumption I'm making is that all of us, in some way, may have been traumatized. Okay. Now, if you need to see me, I have cards. Just kidding. So it's trauma-informed. We don't look at these young men as being criminals. We don't look at them as being horrible people, bad people that come from bad families, which, quite frankly, many people do. Think that way. What we say is, you're somebody's son, you're somebody's grandson, you're somebody's brother, somebody loves you. So we're looking at them from the frame of that you could be my family member. You're just like me. There's nothing different. So I'm going to love on you the way that I would expect someone to love on my family member. So that's part of being trauma-informed. And we partner for collective impact. So we didn't come here, when we developed this program, there's lots of violence intervention programs across Portland. And our goal was not to duplicate effort, but the goal was to work, if you do job vocational training very well, we partner with you. If you can help people find housing super amazingly, we partner with you. The goal is to do what we do best, use our specialty and what we have in terms of our training, which is a little bit more of a medical public health model. And we work well with other people. So we have about 16 people at the table. That includes the mayor's office, the Multnomah County, district attorneys, the Portland Police. We work collectively and collaboratively for collective impact. Excellent. So here's the fidelity of the Healing Hurt People model. It's what we call golden moment engagement. So I'll tell you, the first thing that we do, there's been a lot of shootings, as you know, over the summer. We just had the last few weeks, more than we would like to count, right, Ms. Cheryl? And we got those referrals. So Healing Her People is a partnership between Cascadia Behavioral Health Care, which is one of the largest mental health facilities here in Oregon, and Legacy Emmanuel Hospital. Now, why Legacy Emmanuel Hospital? Well, Legacy tends to see, overwhelmingly, last year they had 185 young people between the ages of 10 to 25 that were either stabbed or shot, and they returned back to the hospital. Okay, that's a problem. It's a problem for me. So we based it on data. We said, where is the greatest need? And that's why, and the chief administrative officer there, Dr. Lori Morgan, who was a trauma surgeon before she took on this administrative role, she worked in Philadelphia. She's a UPenn grad, and she saw what gunshot wounds did to young, vibrant, viable people who could have been contributing members to society. So we work with Legacy, and what we do is the social workers give us a call. As soon as there's a shooting, we get the call within 30 minutes of them arriving into the emergency department. They meet the criteria, and we'll talk a little bit about what that criteria is. And we go in and we engage them right in the trauma bay. Now here's what the literature suggests. Again, we do evidence-based things. We don't just do things to do them. Because I'm a researcher first. So what the evidence says, it's sort of like trauma is like stroke victims. You know, there's a 3-hour window, you have a stroke, and they say if you can get into the hospital within 3 hours to get a specific treatment, TPA, it can reduce the likelihood of longer-term damage post-stroke, right? Well, trauma is very much the same way. The literature suggests that if you can intervene within a 4-hour window and engage young people, or even veterans in this case, because there's also studies on veterans, and engage them post-trauma within that early period, 4-hour window, you can reduce the likelihood of retaliation, one. You can also reduce the likelihood of the development of long-term PTSD and even acute stress disorder. So there's a very specific point of intervention. Now, not just anybody can do this intervention. You have to be trauma-informed, you have to be trained. So we have folks that are trained, that are master's level clinicians, that know how to work with families who have been hurt. Because, you know, violence is not just an individual thing, it's a family thing. It affects everyone who's there. So we've got our master's level trained clinician that goes in within 30 minutes of the call being made, and we also have what's called a peer intervention specialist who engages the young person directly. And our peer intervention specialist is someone who has been hurt themselves and who understands and who has overcome violence in a way that has been able to be productive. And as you know, there's a peer movement model here going on in Portland where what we're realizing is that people learn better and there's a larger impact if there's a peer working with you, right? So there's two-pronged approach in this golden moment. We've got a master's trained clinician working with the family, and we've got a peer intervention specialist working with the injured victim. And we're able to effectively help this young person who's in their most vulnerable state, lying there hurt, bleeding in some cases, in most cases tubes coming out of all areas, and we're able to say, do you think you might want to consider something different? We don't force, but we facilitate a change in conversation. We go from, I gotta go get him, to maybe I need to think about my life in the future. And maybe I can have different options from this point. Because sometimes it's not even an issue of people not wanting other options, but no one ever had the conversation with them. I mean, this is real simple stuff, right? So this is the golden moment work. Then we're still back to I'm just gonna run through that real quick. And then there's in-hospital engagement, where essentially we're with them as long, average length of stay, if you've been injured in the ways that the folks we work with are injured, is about 2 weeks, average. Okay, so that gives us a lot of time to work with folks and work with their families and come up with a plan. So we're in the hospital every day. What do you need? How can we help you? How can we serve you? Coming up with a plan. But the real work happens 6 months to a year out in the community. And that happens for us at Garlington Cascadia, which is right on MLK, which is about 5 minutes away from Legacy Emmanuel. So we're very intentional about places and that people can feel comfortable. And I also might add that at Garlington, it's culturally specific care given. So that means there's an array of different cultures of people who are master's trained clinicians who render that care. Because sometimes it's safer if you can talk to someone who looks like you or relates to you, but then we also have, there's an array of folks there but in that particular tough moment, it's good to sort of feel like you can relate. So that's, the next slide is more about this teachable golden moment, and I think I really talked to you a lot about it already, but I want to just go to the last bullet on here, and really, the Healing Her People model sees this very important moment because it's a moment of vulnerability, and we use motivational interviewing techniques, and the real goal is to facilitate a decision for these young people to do something different. And in this case, we want them to heal and not to retaliate. We talked about this a little bit as well. Again, it's about the in-house engagement, about rapport, relationship building, trauma-informed lens, as we talked about, and the case manager is engaging family and amidst the trauma, and again, the peer intervention specialist is engaging the young person. Here's where a lot of the cool work happens. So we've got the post-discharge follow-up. Let me give you one example. Sometimes these young people are released from the hospital and they're asked to come back within 6 weeks for follow-up. And some of them have significant injuries, colostomy bags, paralyzed, so now I have a new reality. I used to be young and open, and now I'm paralyzed and can't walk. Okay, that's, for a 16-year-old, that's traumatic. So one of the things that we were sort of tasked with thinking about is, if what happens, well, let me ask you this. What do you think the no-show rate is when people, in the past, when these young people have gotten out of the hospital and are asked to follow up in the trauma clinic? 100%? That's pretty close.
80.
But 85%. We've got the scientists up here who's got the physicists, yes, 85%. No show. And then what do you think happens to those people who didn't show up for their follow-up appointment? Just a guess.
They show up sometime.
They show up sometime. Where do you think they end up showing up at? The emergency room, right? So what happens is that they have longer standing infections, things are happening, and then they end up in the place we don't want them to end up, which is the most highly costly place, which is the emergency department. So what Cheryl and our team and Healing Her People do, we make sure that folks get to, this is real simple. We're making sure that they get to their follow-up appointment. And we're saving a bunch of money in the system because now they're not showing up at the emergency department 6 months later or 6 weeks later requiring IV antibiotics because we've got them taken care of when they're supposed to be taken care of. Does that sort of make sense to you? It makes a lot of sense to me, right? That to me is what being human is and being humane and serving people. Okay, so that's one cool thing. The other thing that we're helping them do is, in the community, I think people struggle with the word therapy, so I don't use that, even though I do a lot of it. But more counseling. We can all use wise counsel. And there's a huge distinction to be made between mental health and mental illness. Those are two different things. We should all be concerned with our mental health. If you're not, shame on you. That's not very trauma-informed. I just said that. But we should all be concerned with our mental health. That does not make you mentally ill. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with being mentally ill. If you are, you should be open to getting help for that. Okay? And there should be greater resources for that. So what we make sure that we do is we provide counseling, and there's a self-curriculum. It's an evidence-based practice. It stands for safety, emotions, loss, and future. And we go through this with the young people and their families, and we have them explore this process because it is hard, right, to have been shot, to have been stabbed, to maybe have lost a little bit of your livelihood depending on the depths of your injury. So we make sure that we're working with them to do that. And then, housing is healthcare. Having a job is also healthcare. So we're helping connect you with housing, jobs, vocational training, health insurance. We enrolled almost out of the 29 clients that we served. We enrolled over, I think, about 14 young people, helped them through the help of Legacy to get covered through Cover Oregon. So we're pretty proud of that. The other ones came in, that's worth a clap because they didn't have health. And then we make sure after the 6 months to a year of intensive working and wraparound services that we offer them the opportunity to go back into the community and to work. It's a warm handoff. We don't just dump people, right? It's you finish up, you're still a member of Healing Her People, and essentially what we do is to make sure that the community is aware that you're coming back and that there's some place and some person to receive you. So here are our measures, because for me, it's all about outcomes. It doesn't really mean anything. You can have a fancy program, but if there are no outcomes, then what's the purpose? So essentially, Healing Her People and other programs like it across the country, which is our comparison. So we work in collaboration with the other 22. It's through a network called the National Network of Hospital-Based Violence Intervention Programs. There's a research body, it's a larger accountability body. So we have the national accountability levels, we have our internal accountability goals, and then we also have sort of some of our contractual sort of expectations as well. So we've got a lot of people watching us, but we're watching ourselves to make sure that we're holding ourselves to these outcomes. So here's what we're looking for. Reduction in repeat hospital visits, which in essence will reduce healthcare cost over time, reduction in retaliation, re-injury, and also reduction in arrest. So as you know, there's a lot going on right now. We've got healthcare transformation going on, but we also have prison reform happening right now. Healing Her People is all of that. And we're doing that in a very real and important and effective way. And I'm not just saying that because it's a program that I built. It's because it's true, and you'll see. Why intervene at the level of the hospital? Because that is the question, and this is what really makes us very unique. Traditionally, what happens, well, let me pose a question to you. And we're almost done because the slides we're almost finished with the overall presentation. I want to engage you a little bit more, but if I have a program for young people who may have a higher proclivity towards, violence, and I say, come to me and let me help you, how often do you think people will come knocking down those doors?
How much beer are you offering?
Right. I mean, what's the likelihood? I mean, talk to me. I mean, this is sort of like church, so you can talk to me. I mean, what's the likelihood?
If they feel safe, I think they will.
What's the likelihood that they do?
Low.
Cassie's got it right. Very little. There are wonderful programs out there, but people aren't going to run to beat down the door. So here's how we effectively change the game. I'm coming to you where you are. I'm going to serve you where you are at the very point of your vulnerability. I'm going to respect that. I'm going to change the language that I effectively use with you. You're not considered to be the enemy or the bad person, but you're considered to be the unfortunate person that something happened to. And then it's my responsibility as a human being first to see the humanness in you and to respect that and to operate. Let that be the true essence in which I operate with you. I mean, it really seems really, really simple, but it doesn't happen often. So I'm honoring people for who they could potentially be as well, not who they might think they are in the moment. Those are two different things, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to get too existential on you either, but I often do that too. So here's what the data suggests why we should intervene at the level of the hospital. 44% of young people hospitalized for violence returned with another injury within 5 years. Now, I gave you a very real example at the beginning here with the Milwaukee Hospital example. 20% of them died eventually. And when I say it's needlessly, that's upsetting to me. Why? That's senseless. It doesn't make sense to me. These are young people. These are the future, right? So I gave you a little bit too about this sort of up front about the flow, but this is really sort of the flow of how Healing Her People works. You are, if you're 10 to 25 and you've been stabbed or shot and you're a young male of color and you come into the emergency department via ambulance, via someone dropping you off on the side of the emergency room, which happens more than we would like to see, right, Miss Cheryl? But people are just dropped off right on the side by their buddies because they don't want to get, if you end up at Legacy Emmanuel and you fit that criteria, we will automatically be cued by the social workers and the chaplains at Legacy Emmanuel, which they are amazing partners. And then the flow happens. We introduce ourselves in a very trauma-informed way, in a respectful way. We then engage the client, the family. We do some brief psychoeducation, but mainly just be human in the moment. We enroll them in the program. And it doesn't really matter if you're admitted or discharged. If you meet that criteria, no matter what box you flow in, we're going to get you. And then we work with you for a year, mainly a year. We say 6 months for a year, but mainly the literature suggests that you can be just as effective and get the outcomes you want if you do it for 6 months. But we're sort of overachievers, so we hang on to people. It's more like a year. And then this is what we do: assessments, case management, mentoring, self-groups. We look at ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences. We track those. We provide therapy. Again, all of those things that we sort of talked about. Here's what you probably all have been waiting for. So what are your outcomes so far? We've been up and running for a year, 1 whole year. We have served 29 clients. So that bar at the bottom, because I wanted to get a really good representation so you can see, like, to be dramatic, because this is dramatic. So the bottom bar here, the very bottom with the large blue bar, that's the total number of clients, which were 29. That's about how many clients we served over this year, okay? Then we have, if you look along our y-axis, it tells you it has those measures and those outcomes we're expecting for, right? So the first one is repeat emergency visits in the whole year of the 29 clients we served. What does it say? 0. Oh, I'm impressed with myself. Yeah, okay, 9. Okay, in terms of retaliation, same deal, 0 out of 29. Re-injury, out of all people that came in our program, none of them were re-injured. Now we did, you see a little blip there, we did have 2 rearrests, but they were for non-violent. There were some parole violations around other things. So I wanted to clarify that, because I think our outcomes are pretty darn good. So, yeah. So that is, I gave you sort of the short, sweet version of Healing Hurt People. There is a more pronounced version available that I could, or a longer version that kind of goes into the neurobiology of violence and all that good stuff, that I can send to Corinne for your distribution. Now that I know that you're all scientists and they actually be super interested in that stuff, we'll send it to you. Oh, I'm sorry, I wanted to go back to this Partner for a Change. I had mentioned at the beginning that, oftentimes I was reading this leadership book, because I like to read a lot of different stuff. So one of the things that was said is every time we think about when you think of the Sistine Chapel, who do you think of? Michelangelo. Isn't that funny? Because what this leadership book says is, that's the darn problem. Every time we think about the Sistine Chapel, we think about Michelangelo, but he had 16 other people working with him. What the heck happened to the 16 other people? Right, but that's the kind of culture we live in. We want to identify one person that did it, right? And Michelangelo, I'm sure he's rolling in his grave and he's saying, but there were 16 others with me. Anyway, so it's very much sort of like this sort of, it's not just me, it's all of, or Miss Cheryl, but it's about 20 people who committed their lives, their time, their energy, their passion, their talents, employed their gifts to help us develop this program over 2 years ago. It started with me in a little cubicle, and the concept came through the director of the medical director over at Cascadia and their president said, we saw this little program, we think it might work in Portland, do you think you can operationalize it? So then I took it, so I'd say that they were sort of, we had the sperm donors, then they basically inseminated me. I then birthed this thing, and now I've got really good godparents or parents in Cheryl and Josh Washington. So that's the best I could sort of think of. I'm sure there's probably a better example, but anyway. So these are all the folks. We've got Department of Community Justice, we've got the Police Department, we have the Mayor's Office of Youth Violence Prevention, all of the folks at Legacy, from their social workers, their trauma nurses, the physicians, the Chief Administrative Officer. From the top, we have the champions. We've got folks from TIPS, which is a trauma intervention program. Our goal was not to reinvent the wheel or duplicate effort, because that's a waste of time. It's just not, I don't think it doesn't demonstrate our ability to be judicious with our best resources. So they're all at our table. Every month, we come to the same table together once a month, and we talk about where we are and where we want to go. Because we all do something different and do it well. And the goal is for collective impact. So again, the next time you guys think about the Sistine Chapel, you remind people there were 16 other folks with Michelangelo, okay? And now we're just to the summary. Healing Hurt People Portland is a trauma-informed and evidence-based program. It reduces, we've been able to show and demonstrate our ability, and I should say, these are the similar outcomes that the other 22 programs across the country have been able to demonstrate as well. So we are following suit, and it's such a needed program. We reduce repeat emergency room visits. We've been able to reduce re-injury. We've lowered overall health costs. We've helped young people who have, in the past, had not had access to health care, can now go see a primary care physician, not in an emergency room setting. We've increased economic opportunity and employability for what I call opportunity youth. I really don't like the word at risk, because all of us are at risk. of something. To be trauma-informed and more strength-based, there's opportunity in each one of those young people. If we just see one good thing in somebody that we can foster, I think the world can become a better place, and that is indeed you all's mission, right? Is one person at a time. Let me see the.
Help off.
Let me get the three things because I want to get it right. I moved out of my spot. Okay. So the motto: to live better, to help often, and to wonder more. So this is definitely consistent with your motto, right? Which is why Corinne had the great foresight to invite me here today. All right. So the other thing I will say is that it increases access to educational opportunities, and it also has some implications for prison reform, as I mentioned before. So that is where we are. We're super excited, and I will also say that I'm the only psychiatrist that leads one of the 23. I'm the only psychiatrist leading one of these programs. The other programs, they have trauma surgeons that lead the program. So we effectively have a very different spirit and personality, and some of the things that we're doing here are actually being adopted across into other sites. So, psychiatrists matter. And with that, I don't know what the format is. Do we take questions, give it over, or what? I am officially done with the formal presentation. If you have questions, concerns, challenges, reservations, we can address those as well.
Dr. Moreland-Capuia, I was wondering if there's anything that you would have us do. I mean, any call to action or what would you?
Absolutely. So, Ms. Cheryl, stand up again. So we have, first of all, one of the things that I do, I'd like to, everyone who wants to come volunteer, some of the things that we have going, let me just give you some examples. We have a young lady from Pacific University who's working on her doctorate, and she's doing, as a part of her postdoctoral work, she's going to be doing program evaluation for Healing Her People for the next year. We're working, OHSU has the OHSU Women's Research Center, and I know it's men and women, but they're bringing their talents and gifts to sort of help us think more clearly about how we move towards sort of publishing our results and all of these really cool things that we're doing with the program. Many of you seem to have tremendous talents and gifts, and I would just say the best way to for us to sort of assess your ability to be useful, which I know is great, is to contact Ms. Cheryl directly, and I will get that email address. I don't know if she wasn't probably prepared to bring cards today, and my cards have changed, but either one of us you can contact, but mainly Ms. Cheryl, and there's all sorts of ways. We have a young man from Soul River, runs deep, and he's teaching these young men how to be, how to be a little bit more pro-social. So he does fly fishing and teaches conservation. And who would have thought that young people from, inner Northeast and East Portland would find solace and refuge in learning how to fly fish, but it's very therapeutic. So if you have something like that, or reading, being a wonderful librarian, all these things count. So who you are, what you bring counts, and we can use you. If you want to be used, in a great way. Please contact Ms. Cheryl, and we'll should I just get the email address to you?
I'll make sure to put it on all the websites.
Great, awesome.